November 16, 1720. Spanish town, Jamaica, and Bonny's wrists are raw beneath the iron shackles. She stands in the suffocating heat, 20 feet from the gallows, watching the trapdoor swing open beneath Calico Jack Rackham's feet. Her lover, the father of the child growing inside her. His body jerks, the rope creaks, the crowd roars, but their eyes aren't on him. They're on her. 3,000 people packed into the square, and every single one of them wants to see the women hang. Not the men, the women, because Bonny and Mary Read didn't just commit piracy. They committed something worse. They refused to be what women were supposed to be. A merchant's wife near the front is screaming. Not in horror, in excitement. She's brought her daughters to watch, teaching them a lesson about what happens to women who abandon their place. The crowd presses closer. Someone throws rotting fruit. It hits Mary Read in the face, and the laughter is deafening. The magistrate reads the sentence. Death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. But then a pause. The midwife steps forward. Anne and Mary are examined in front of the entire crowd. Hands on their bellies. Invasive. Humiliating. Public theater disguised as legal procedure. The verdict. Both women are quick with child. The law is clear. A pregnant woman cannot be executed. The unborn child is innocent. The crowd groans in disappointment. They came for a show. They wanted to see women swing. And Bonny is led back to prison. The chains bite into her ankles. She has 9 months, maybe less. 9 months to hold her baby. 9 months to imagine its face. 9 months to know that the moment she gives birth, they will take the child from her arms and drag her back to this square. The mercy is temporary. The execution is simply delayed. But what happened to Bonny in those months? What happened to Mary Read before she died in that prison? What the law did to hundreds of women whose names we'll never know? That was worse than hanging. Because female pirates didn't just face the noose. They faced punishment specifically crafted for women who dared to take their freedom. Their bodies became warnings. Their deaths became spectacles. Their stories became erasures. This is the truth about what happened to women pirates after arrest. And it's more disturbing than you've been told. When a man turned pirate, he committed one crime. When a woman turned pirate, she committed two. The first crime was piracy, theft, murder, rebellion against the crown. But the second crime? That was the one that made judges demand harsher sentences. The one that made crowds scream for blood. The crime of being a woman who refused her place. English law in the 1700s had a specific term for it. Petty treason. It was the legal concept applied when someone betrayed their natural superior. A servant who killed their master. A wife who killed her husband. And a woman who abandoned her role entirely. Because in the eyes of the law, a woman belonged to someone. Her father. Her husband. The crown. When she stepped onto a pirate ship, she didn't just break maritime law. She broke the fundamental order of society itself. The legal documents are explicit about this. In a 1721 treatise on criminal law, the Attorney General wrote that women pirates were unnatural creatures who have abandoned all pretense of feminine virtue and thereby forfeited the protections afforded to their sex. Read that again. They forfeited the protections afforded to their sex. Male pirates could claim desperation, poverty, or coercion. They were still men fulfilling masculine roles, just on the wrong side of the law. But a woman with a cutlass? A woman commanding a crew? A woman who fired a pistol instead of fainting at the sight of blood? She had become something the law couldn't categorize. Something dangerous. And the numbers tell us just how dangerous authorities considered them. We have documented records of at least 130 female pirates tried in British, Spanish, French, and Dutch courts between 1650 and 1830. But those are only the ones who made it to trial. Prison ship logs reference hundreds more, women recorded only as numbers, not names. Archaeological excavations near Port Royal, Jamaica have uncovered mass graves with female skeletal remains showing evidence of hanging trauma. The real number? Historians estimate somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 women were executed for piracy-related crimes during the golden age of piracy alone. But here's what made female pirates uniquely terrifying to the authorities. They fell into 3 categories, and each one represented a different kind of threat. First, the disguised. Women who cut their hair, bound their chests, and passed as men for years. Mary Read did this. So did Bonny, at least initially. When their true sex was revealed, it raised an uncomfortable question. How many other men in the Navy or merchant fleets were actually women? If gender could be faked that easily, what did that say about masculine authority? Second, the openly female. Pirates like Qing Shi in China or Jean de Clisson in France, who commanded fleets while visibly, undeniably women. They proved women could lead. They could strategize. They could be more brutal and more successful than men. Grace O'Malley controlled the entire western coast of Ireland for decades. She didn't hide. She conquered. That was a problem for every king, every admiral, every husband who insisted women were naturally weak. Third, the companions. Wives, lovers, prostitutes who served on pirate ships. These women weren't necessarily fighters, but they were accomplices. They chose pirate communities over respectable society. They chose freedom, even violent, precarious freedom, over the safety of marriage and motherhood. And that choice was seen as contagious. Because if women could be pirates, truly be pirates, not forced captives or tragic victims, but willing participants, then what else could they do? The trial transcripts reveal the panic. In Bonny's case, the prosecutor spent more time discussing her abandonment of feminine modesty than her actual crimes. In Mary Read's trial, witnesses were asked repeatedly whether she had shown any sign of natural female tenderness. When she hadn't, it was used as evidence of her depravity. The London newspapers called them she-devils. Port Royal preachers declared them Jezebels who would lead all women into damnation. This wasn't just about stopping piracy. This was about making an example, about showing every woman in every port town, every fishing village, every colonial settlement what happened when you stepped outside the lines drawn for you. Male pirates were criminals. Female pirates were threats to civilization itself. And the punishment had to match. October 22, 1720. Just off the coast of Jamaica, a Royal Navy sloop closes in on a small pirate vessel. The crew of the William has been hunting this ship for days. When they finally board, cutlasses drawn, they expect a fight. What they find instead is a deck full of drunk men hiding below. And 2 women standing alone, weapons ready. And Bonny and Mary Read are the only ones still on deck. While Calico Jack and his crew cowered in the hold, too drunk on stolen rum to fight, these 2 women fired pistols at the Navy boarding party. Mary Read was so furious at the cowardice around her that she allegedly fired down into the hold, killing one of her own crew members. The Navy report describes it. The women pirates were very active on board and willing to do anything. That phrase, willing to do anything, would seal their fate. They were arrested. All of them. The men, the women, everyone aboard. Taken to Spanish Town, Jamaica, where they would face trial for piracy under British maritime law. November 16, 1720. The courtroom is packed. The trial should have been straightforward. Piracy carried one sentence: death. But the presence of 2 women turned it into theater. Spectators crowded the gallery. Merchants and their wives, sailors, slaves, even children. Everyone wanted to see the women pirates. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified. A merchant captain described how Bonny had boarded his ship and threatened to blow his brains out. A fisherman swore he saw Mary Read, dressed as a man, killing a sailor with her own hands during a raid. The defense had nothing. Calico Jack Rackham stood silent. The other male crew members begged for mercy, claiming they'd been forced into piracy. But Mary Read, she stood up and spoke. "I was born illegitimate," she told the court. "Raised as a boy so my mother could claim my dead brother's inheritance. I served as a soldier in the British Army in Flanders. I fought in battles where men died beside me, and they never knew I was a woman. I married a soldier. When he died, I went to sea. And yes, I became a pirate." The courtroom was stunned into silence. Then she turned to Calico Jack, still standing there, pathetic and trembling. If he had fought like a man, he needn't hang like a dog. The judge called for order. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. All of them. Sentence. Death by hanging. But before the magistrate could set an execution date, both women spoke again. We plead our bellies. It was an ancient legal right. A woman could request a physical examination to determine if she was pregnant. If she was, execution would be postponed until after the birth. The law protected the unborn child, not the mother. The court had no choice but to allow it. What happened next was designed to humiliate. 2 midwives were summoned. In front of the entire courtroom, in front of judges, lawyers, spectators, the male pirates they'd sailed with, and Bonny and Mary Read were examined. Their bodies inspected. Their conditions discussed openly. Their privacy violated as entertainment. The verdict came back. Both women were quick with child. The men were executed on November 18, 1720. Calico Jack Rackham's body was hung in an iron cage at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor as a warning. And Bonny was allowed to see him one final time before his execution. Her last words to him are recorded. I'm sorry to see you here, but if you'd fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog. She echoed Mary's words. Then she was taken back to prison. The 2 women were separated. Different cells. No contact. 9 months to wait for their babies to be born. 9 months to know what came after. Mary Read never made it that long. April 28, 1721. 5 months after her conviction. The prison records simply note, Mary Read, deceased. The official cause was fever. But women who knew her testified later that she'd been bleeding. A miscarriage. Or an infection from the filthy conditions in Spanish Town prison. Or perhaps something worse, a botched attempt to end the pregnancy herself, knowing what waited on the other side of childbirth. She was buried in an unmarked grave. No funeral. No record of where. The woman who fought armies and commanded pirates died alone in a cell and was thrown into the ground like refuse. And Bonny? Here's where the story becomes a ghost. There is no execution record for Bonny. None. No documentation of her death. No burial record. No witness accounts of her hanging. After December 1721, she simply vanishes from all official documents. 3 theories have emerged over the centuries. Theory 1. She was executed shortly after giving birth. The baby was taken, probably sent to an orphanage or killed, and Anne was hanged quietly without the public spectacle. Her execution wasn't recorded because the authorities wanted to erase her from memory. No story, no legend, just silence. Theory 2. Her father bought her freedom. William Cormack was a wealthy lawyer in Charlestown, South Carolina. Some historians believe he paid an enormous bribe to Jamaican officials to secure her release. If true, Anne would have returned to the colonies under a different name, lived quietly and died in obscurity. There's a gravestone in South Carolina for an Anne Burleigh, who died in 1782 at age 82. Some believe it's her. Theory 3. She died in prison just like Mary. No fever this time, but childbirth complications. Or starvation. Or suicide. The baby likely died too. And rather than record it, the authorities simply disposed of the bodies and erased her from the ledgers. We'll never know which theory is true. And that might be the most disturbing outcome of all. Because Bonny's silence, her complete disappearance from the historical record, wasn't an accident. It was a choice made by the people in power. The judges, the jailers, the record keepers. They decided her story didn't deserve to exist. Male pirates became legends. Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, Henry Morgan. Their names lived on in stories, songs, myths. Even the worst of them were remembered. But Bonny? Mary Read? The law didn't just kill them. It erased them. It made sure that future generations of women wouldn't have their example. Wouldn't know that women had fought, commanded, conquered. The silence was the punishment. Stories like Bonny's were deliberately erased from history. We're bringing them back to light on Throne of Lies. If you think these hidden truths deserve to be told, Subscribe so we can keep exposing what they tried to bury. Your subscription is your vote that these women's stories matter. Death was not the punishment. Death was the mercy that came at the end. When male pirates were sentenced to hang, the process was brutal but efficient. Execution dock in Wapping, London. Low tide. A short rope designed for slow strangulation rather than a quick neck snap. The body left dangling as the Thames rose and fell 3 times. The symbolic 3 tides that marked the Admiralty's jurisdiction over the seas. Then it was over. Cut down. Buried or gibbeted. Done. But when women faced the same sentence, the process transformed into something else entirely. The execution became a performance, a morality play, a public destruction of not just a life, but of the very idea that women could exist outside male control. Let's start with what happened at execution dock when a woman stood on that scaffold. The standard procedure was modified. The crowd that gathered was always larger, sometimes double or triple the usual size. Because this wasn't just an execution. This was a spectacle of gender correction. Before the hanging, the women were stripped of their outer garments. Not fully naked, that would have been considered obscene, but down to their underclothes. This wasn't done to male pirates. The justification was searching for concealed weapons or charms. But the real purpose was obvious. Humiliation. Reducing these women back to bodies. Vulnerable. Exposed. Female. The condemned woman would stand there, shivering in the river wind, while the executioner placed the noose around her neck. But here's what most people don't know. Women were often fitted with what the records call a pirate's collar before execution. It was an iron band, locked around the throat, with a chain attached. This device served 2 purposes. First, it prevented last-minute attempts at escape, though where a chained, surrounded woman could possibly escape to remains unclear. Second, and more importantly, it made the gibbeting process easier. Because the bodies weren't coming down after 3 tides. Court records from 1735 describe the execution of a woman named Elizabeth Black Bess Bathory. No relation to the Hungarian countess, just an unfortunate name. She'd been convicted of piracy off the coast of Cornwall. After her hanging, her body was placed in a gibbet cage and hoisted at the entrance to Plymouth Harbor. The standard display time for male pirates was 3 to 6 months. Elizabeth Bathory's body hung there for 14 months. 14 months of decay, of exposure, of birds. The records note that local women were brought to the harbor specifically to see what remained of her, as instruction in the wages of sin and unfeminine conduct. The body was teaching a lesson even in death. But hanging was actually the most merciful method of execution a female pirate could hope for. Some weren't that fortunate. Burning at the stake was legally reserved for petty treason, the murder of a husband or master. But the legal definition of petty treason was flexible when applied to women who'd committed what judges called masculine crimes. In 1673, a woman named Catherine Haggarty was convicted of piracy along the Irish coast. She'd served on a French privateer that attacked English merchant vessels. When captured, she was tried not just for piracy, but for unnatural acts against her sex and against the crown. The sentence: burning. The law technically required that women be strangled at the stake before the fire was lit, a small mercy to prevent them from burning alive. The executioner would tighten a rope or iron collar around the neck until the woman lost consciousness or died, then light the pyre. Catherine Haggarty was not strangled first. Contemporary accounts describe her screaming as the flames reached her. The execution took 17 minutes. Witnesses reported that she remained conscious for at least 8 of those minutes. Why? Because the magistrate had ruled that her crimes were so abhorrent to nature that she deserved to feel the full measure of punishment. The fire was meant to purify, to burn away the corruption of a woman who dared to hold a weapon, to kill, to command men. The symbolism was explicit. Her body itself was evidence of sin, and it needed to be destroyed completely. At least 6 other documented cases exist of female pirates burned at the stake between 1650 and 1789. All in cases where judges determined their crimes went beyond mere piracy into the realm of crimes against nature. Then there was gibbeting. The gibbet was an iron cage built to roughly match human proportions. After execution, the body was forced into the cage, sometimes while still warm, and hoisted on a tall pole at a harbor entrance, a crossroads, or a prominent beach. The purpose was deterrence. Sailors arriving in port would see the rotting corpse and remember what happened to pirates. But when the body in the cage was female, the purpose expanded. Women's bodies were left longer, displayed more prominently. In 1701, the body of a female pirate known only as Red Mary was gibbeted at the mouth of the River Thames. Port records indicate her cage remained there for 3 years and 4 months. 3 years. Long after the flesh had rotted away. Long after the birds had picked the bones clean. Long after there was nothing left but a skeleton in rusted iron. Because the lesson wasn't just for sailors. It was for women. Every woman who walked past that harbor, who looked up and saw what was left of a woman who'd chosen freedom over obedience. The psychological torture extended beyond the dead woman herself. Families were forbidden from claiming bodies for proper burial. In some cases, family members who tried to cut down gibbeted bodies were arrested and flogged. Mothers watched their daughters decay in cages. Sisters, friends, unable to do anything but witness the slow, public decomposition. But the cruelty didn't wait until execution. Before a woman ever reached the gallows or the stake or the gibbet, there was the prison. And in prison, there was torture designed to extract confessions, reveal accomplices, or simply break spirits. Pressing was common. The accused woman would be laid on the ground, and heavy stones would be placed on a board across her chest. More weight added each day until she either confessed or died. The legal phrase was pressing to death for standing mute. A woman named Jane Harley endured pressing for 3 days in 1718 after refusing to confess to piracy charges. She finally confessed, not to the crimes she was accused of, but to anything the interrogators wanted to hear, just to make it stop. She was executed 2 days later, unable to stand upright from the damage to her ribs and lungs. The rack was used. Thumbscrews, iron boots heated over flames. All legally sanctioned. All documented in court records. But there was another form of torture that rarely appears in official documents, though we know it happened from private letters and journals. Sexual violence. Female pirates were held in prisons run by male jailers. They were transported on prison ships crewed by male sailors. They were interrogated by male magistrates, often alone. The trial record for a woman named Sarah Bishop, convicted of piracy in 1725, includes testimony from a fellow prisoner who stated that Sarah had been visited nightly by the jailer during her imprisonment. When this was brought to the judge's attention, his response was recorded. She has already proven herself to be a woman of base character, and her treatment is no concern of this court. The message was clear. Once a woman stepped outside societal protection by becoming a pirate, she forfeited all protections. She could be violated, tortured, degraded, and it was considered part of her punishment. Some women were held in solitary confinement below deck on prison hulks. Decommissioned warships converted into floating prisons. These black holes were airless compartments in the lowest part of the ship, with no light, no sanitation, no human contact except when food was shoved through a slot once a day. Women held there for months before trial sometimes emerged unable to walk, their legs atrophied. Some emerged mad. Some didn't emerge at all. In 1722, 3 women awaiting trial for piracy were held in the black hole of a prison hulk anchored off Jamaica. When the trial date arrived, only one was still alive. The other 2 had died in the darkness. The cause of death was listed as jail fever, but a ship's surgeon who examined the bodies noted in his private journal that both showed signs of severe malnutrition and untreated wounds. They had been forgotten, left to die in the dark below the waterline, their screams unheard. The execution was meant to be the climax, the public finale. But for female pirates, the real punishment was everything that came before. The humiliation, the violation, the systematic destruction of their bodies and minds before they ever reached the scaffold. Death wasn't the punishment. Death was the escape. There was one way a condemned woman could delay her execution. One legal loophole that existed across British, Spanish, French, and Dutch maritime law. A single phrase that could buy time when no other defense remained. I plead my belly, for words that meant, I am pregnant. And the law was absolute on this point. An unborn child was considered innocent. To execute a pregnant woman was to execute the innocent along with the guilty. So if a woman could prove she was quick with child, meaning the pregnancy had progressed far enough that movement could be felt, her execution would be postponed until after the birth. Sounds like mercy. It was actually one of the cruelest aspects of the entire system. When a woman pled her belly, the court had no choice but to investigate. But the investigation itself was designed to humiliate, to strip away any remaining dignity before death. The procedure was standardized across jurisdictions. A jury of matrons would be assembled. Usually 12 women, often midwives or women who'd borne multiple children themselves. They would be sworn in just like a criminal jury. Then the examination would take place. In the courtroom, in front of the judge, the prosecutors, the other prisoners, the spectators who'd packed the gallery. The condemned woman would be taken to a side chamber, sometimes not even that, sometimes right there in open court, and the matrons would examine her body, hands on her belly, checking for swelling, for movement, for any sign of pregnancy. The woman had no right to refuse, no right to privacy. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the court, to be inspected like evidence. The matrons would deliberate briefly, then return their verdict to the judge. The court records use the same phrase over and over, found quick with child. When Bonny and Mary Read pled their bellies in November 1720, the examination was conducted in a room adjacent to the courtroom. But the doors were left open. The male prisoners they'd sailed with, the men who were about to hang, watched. The spectators craned their necks to see. Both women were confirmed pregnant. The court had no choice but to grant the stay of execution. And that's when the real torture began. Because now they had time. 9 months, maybe less. 9 months to sit in a prison cell and do the mathematics. A pregnancy is approximately 280 days. Every morning you wake up, that's one fewer day. Every time you feel the baby move, you're closer to the moment when they'll take it from your arms and lead you to the gallows. The psychological warfare was extraordinary. You're bonding with a child you'll never raise. Feeling it grow. Imagining its face. Knowing with absolute certainty that the moment it's born, your protection vanishes. Some women tried to prolong the pregnancy. Eating less, trying to slow the baby's growth. Binding their bellies to hide how far along they were. Anything to buy more time. Others tried to end it. Better to miscarry than to hold your child once and then die. The prison records from Spanish Town, Jamaica include entries for birthing rooms. Separate cells where pregnant prisoners were moved as their due dates approached. These rooms were monitored constantly. Guards watched to ensure the women didn't harm themselves or attempt to terminate the pregnancies. Because the baby had to be born alive. That was the whole point. And when the day finally came, when labor started, the woman would be attended by a midwife, but also by guards. The birth would be recorded. The baby would be taken immediately. Not an hour later. Not the next day. Immediately. Court documents from a 1715 case in Port Royal describe what happened to a woman named Margaret Critchett, convicted of piracy. She gave birth to a daughter in prison. The midwife cut the cord, wrapped the baby, and handed it to a guard. Margaret was given minutes. Witnesses said less than 10, to hold her child before it was removed. She was executed 4 days later. The baby? The records show it was sent to a parish orphanage. Most children born to condemned pirates ended up in orphanages, if they survived at all. Infant mortality rates in these institutions were above 70%. The babies were considered tainted by their mother's sins, unwanted, stigmatized, left to die of disease or neglect. Some babies never left the prison. When Mary Read died in April 1721, there's evidence she was still pregnant, about 5 months along. The baby died with her. No separate burial. No record. Just another unmarked grave with two bodies instead of one. In a handful of cases, babies died within days or weeks of birth while their mothers were still alive and awaiting execution. These women had to watch their infants sicken and die in the same cell where they were imprisoned. Then, after burying the child they'd carried for 9 months, they were led to the gallows anyway. The stay of execution was only ever temporary. But here's where desperation drove some women to an even darker choice. False pregnancy claims. The court records mention these cases, though not frequently. Women who weren't pregnant but claimed to be, hoping to buy time. Hoping maybe their crew would mount a rescue. Hoping for a pardon. Hoping for anything except the noose. The problem was, the examination would reveal the lie within minutes. And the punishment for false pleading was severe. In 1708, a woman named Elizabeth Cooper claimed pregnancy after being convicted of piracy off the Carolinas. The jury of matrons examined her and found no evidence of pregnancy. Not only was her execution carried out immediately, no further delays, but she was flogged before being hanged. 20 lashes in the public square, then straight to the scaffold. The message was clear. You get one chance at this mercy, and if you lie, you'll suffer more for it. But even when the pregnancy was real, even when everything followed legal procedure, the experience was designed to torture. Imagine it. You're locked in a stone cell, damp, cold. The baby growing inside you is the only thing keeping you alive. You feel it kick and you think, that kick just bought me another week. Another day. You give birth in chains. You hold your child for seconds, minutes if you're lucky. You see its face, its tiny fingers. You hear it cry, then it's gone. And you're dragged to the place where you'll die, milk still leaking from your breasts, your body torn from childbirth, knowing that child will never know your name. The legal system called this mercy because it preserved innocent life. But it was torture. Calculated, systematic, psychological torture that lasted 9 months and ended with a double loss. The child taken, then your life. And Bonny's pregnancy saved her from the immediate noose in November 1720. She watched Calico Jack hang. She was taken back to prison. She felt the baby grow. And then she vanished from the records entirely. We don't know if she gave birth. We don't know if there was a baby. We don't know if she was executed after or died before or somehow escaped. The silence is complete. But for every in Bonny whose fate remains a mystery, there are dozens of other women whose fates are documented. Women who pled their bellies. Women who gave birth in chains. Women who held their babies for moments before execution. Women who were given just enough hope to make the despair that followed utterly devastating. October 8, 1789. Boston, Massachusetts. 69 years after Anne Bonny vanished from the records. 13 years after American independence. The same year George Washington took office as the first president of the United States. A woman named Rachel Wall is about to become the last woman executed in Massachusetts. She's 29 years old. Rachel Wall's story began in a small Pennsylvania farming community. At 16, she ran away from home and married a fisherman named George Wall. They moved to Boston. He went to sea. She worked as a servant in the homes of wealthy merchants. It was a normal life. Boring. Poor. Safe. Then George came home one day with a different proposal. He'd met some men. Men who worked the shipping lanes off the New England coast. Men who didn't just fish, they hunted. Rachel said yes. For the next few years, Rachel and George Wall ran a simple but effective scheme. After storms, they'd sail out in a small vessel and position themselves near the shipping lanes. Rachel would stand on deck, waving frantically, screaming for help. When merchant ships pulled alongside to assist the distressed woman, George and his crew would board with weapons drawn. They'd rob the ship. Sometimes they'd kill the crew and scuttle the vessel to eliminate witnesses. Then they'd sail back to Boston, dock at the harbor like any other fishing boat, and sell the stolen goods. Rachel participated in at least 12 of these raids. Court documents later estimated they'd stolen over $6,000, roughly $200,000 in today's money, and killed at least 24 sailors. Then George Wall drowned during a storm in 1782. The crew disbanded. Rachel went back to Boston and returned to work as a servant. For 7 years, she lived quietly. No one suspected. No one knew. She was just another poor widow trying to survive. Until September 1789, when she was caught stealing a bonnet worth 75 cents from a young woman walking near the docks. Highway robbery, a minor crime, normally punishable by flogging or a few months in jail. But Rachel Wall had made a critical mistake. During her interrogation, trying to explain her circumstances, she mentioned that she'd known hard times at sea. The magistrate pressed her. She admitted she'd sailed with her husband, admitted they'd taken goods from ships. She was careful. She never used the word pirate. She never admitted to killing anyone. She claimed they'd only robbed already damaged vessels, never attacked anyone. But it didn't matter. The word spread. The woman arrested for stealing a bonnet was actually a pirate. The trial became a sensation. Newspapers ran stories for weeks before the proceedings even began. The Boston Gazette described her as a woman of modest appearance but immodest history. The Massachusetts Sentinel published sketches of her. Something rarely done for any criminal, let alone someone accused of petty theft. The courtroom was packed on the day of her trial. So many people tried to attend that guards had to turn hundreds away at the door. Rachel's defense strategy was straightforward. Admit to theft, deny everything else. Yes, she stole the bonnet. Yes, she'd been involved in some robberies at sea years ago. But no, she never killed anyone. No, she wasn't a pirate, just a desperate woman married to a bad man. The prosecution didn't need to prove the piracy charges. They only needed to prove the highway robbery, the bonnet. But they spent hours presenting testimony about her life at sea. Witnesses who claimed to have heard stories about the Wall crew. Survivors from ships that had been attacked. None of it was directly provable. All of it was prejudicial. The jury deliberated for 30 minutes. Guilty. Sentence. Death by hanging. Rachel Wall's lawyer immediately filed for appeal, arguing that the punishment was grossly disproportionate to the crime. Highway robbery, especially a first offense, virtually never carried a death sentence. The appeal was denied within a week, because this wasn't really about a stolen bonnet. This was about a woman who'd lived as a pirate for years and gotten away with it. A woman who'd used her femininity, her ability to play the damsel in distress, as a weapon. The authorities needed to make an example. October 8, 1789 was set as the execution date. The morning arrived cold and gray. Rachel was kept in a cell beneath the courthouse. At dawn, she was given a chance to write final letters. The one surviving letter, addressed to her mother, has been preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. In it, she writes, "I am sorry for the crimes I committed, but I swear before God I never took a life. They are hanging me for what I am, not for what I did." At 10 a.m., the guards came for her. The walk from the prison to the gallows was half a mile. In London, condemned prisoners were transported in carts. In Boston, they walked, hands bound, guards on either side, through streets lined with spectators. Contemporary accounts described the scene. Thousands of people lined the route. Some had traveled from neighboring towns specifically to witness this. Not just men, entire families. Children held up on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. They didn't come to see justice. They came to see a woman die. The Boston Gazette's coverage of the execution is preserved in the archives. The reporter describes Rachel's appearance in excruciating detail. She wore a simple gray dress, somewhat worn. Her hair was covered with a white cap. Her face showed the marks of a hard life, though she walked with composure and dignity. No male criminal was ever described this way. When men were executed, newspapers reported the crime and the sentence. They didn't describe what the condemned man wore or whether his face was weathered. But Rachel Wall was a woman. Her body was part of the spectacle. She reached the gallows at approximately 10:45 a.m. A minister offered her a chance to pray. She declined. She was asked if she had any final words. The execution record preserves her statement. "I am innocent of murder. I have been a thief. I have been wild and disobedient to my parents. But I never killed anyone, and I am dying for crimes I did not commit. Then she looked directly at the crowd and said something that didn't make it into the official record, but was preserved in a witness's private journal. You came to see a woman hang. I hope you're satisfied. The executioner placed the noose around her neck, the hood over her head. At 11:07 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Rachel Wall died by slow strangulation. The drop wasn't enough to break her neck. Witnesses reported it took nearly 8 minutes before she stopped moving. Her body was cut down after an hour. According to Massachusetts law, the bodies of executed criminals were not to be returned to families. Rachel Wall was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison yard. Except the prison yard was later demolished and built over. The location of her grave is unknown. She's somewhere beneath modern Boston, under a street, a building, a parking lot. No marker, no memorial, no indication that Rachel Wall ever existed. The newspaper coverage continued for weeks after her death. But the articles weren't about justice or crime. They were morality lessons. The Boston Gazette ran a series called The Fate of Immodest Women, using Rachel as an example of what happens when women abandon their proper roles. She was turned into a cautionary tale, a ghost story to frighten girls into obedience. And then, slowly, she was forgotten. For 2 centuries, Rachel Wall existed only in a handful of archived court documents and newspaper clippings. No historian wrote about her. No one remembered her name. She was erased as thoroughly as if she'd never lived. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers rediscovered her story. The last woman hanged in Massachusetts. The only American-born female pirate with documented evidence. A woman who was executed not for the crimes she committed, but for daring to live outside the lines drawn for her. Rachel Wall died alone, buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten for centuries. You're watching her story 235 years later because channels like Throne of Lies refuse to let history erase inconvenient women. If you believe these stories deserve an audience, hit subscribe. Don't let her die forgotten twice. Every woman pirate we've discussed so far ended the same way. Prison, torture, execution, erasure. Every single one, except one. Her name was Qing Shi, and she commanded the most powerful pirate fleet in human history. Between 1807 and 1810, Qing Shi controlled over 1,800 vessels and 80,000 pirates along the southern coast of China. To put that in perspective, Blackbeard commanded 4 ships at his peak, and Bonny sailed on a single sloop. The entire Royal Navy of Great Britain in 1808 had approximately 600 ships. Qing Shi commanded 3 times that number. She didn't just raid merchant vessels. She controlled entire regions of coastline, collected taxes from fishing villages, issued safe passage documents that traders had to purchase to sail through her waters. She ran a maritime empire with its own laws, its own courts, its own government. The Chinese Imperial Navy tried to stop her. They failed, repeatedly. In 1809, she defeated a massive imperial fleet sent to destroy her, captured 63 warships and added them to her own armada. The Portuguese Navy tried. They failed worse. She sank their ships and hung their officers from her masts. The British East India Company, the most powerful commercial entity in the world, avoided her waters entirely. They rerouted trade ships thousands of miles out of their way rather than risk encountering her fleet. Qing Shi was unstoppable. And in 1810, she negotiated a full pardon from the Chinese government. She walked away, kept most of her wealth, retired to run a gambling house in Canton. She died peacefully in 1844 at the age of 69, surrounded by family, one of the wealthiest women in southern China. No prison, no torture, no execution, no erasure. She's the exception. The only female pirate of the era who survived on her own terms. But here's what's crucial to understand. Qing Shi's survival had nothing to do with mercy. It had everything to do with geography. She operated in Chinese waters, under Chinese law, dealing with Chinese authorities. She never encountered European maritime law. never faced a British judge or a Spanish magistrate, never stood trial in a system designed to punish women for existing outside male control. Because if the British Royal Navy had captured Qing Shi instead of avoiding her waters, she wouldn't have negotiated anything. There would have been no pardon, no retirement, no peaceful death. Let's be clear about what would have happened. First, the capture itself would have been treated as a monumental victory. The woman who commanded 80,000 pirates, who defeated imperial fleets, who terrified the most powerful navies in the world, brought down. The propaganda value alone would have been extraordinary. She would have been transported to London in chains, paraded through the streets, put on display like an exotic animal before the trial even began. The trial would have been the most publicized in British history. Every newspaper in Europe would have covered it. Sketch artists would have filled galleries drawing her face, her clothing, every detail of her appearance. And the verdict was never in doubt. Guilty of piracy, murder, rebellion against every maritime power that claimed jurisdiction over the seas. But before execution, there would have been interrogation. Not the legal kind, the extraction kind. Qing Shi knew things the British desperately wanted to know. The locations of hidden treasure. The names of corrupt officials in the Chinese government who'd worked with her. The structure of her fleet. Trade routes. Supplier networks. They would have used every method available to extract that information. The rack, pressing, sleep deprivation, starvation, everything we discussed earlier, but amplified because the prize was so valuable. And when they'd gotten everything they could from her, or when she'd endured enough that there was nothing left to extract, she would have been executed. But not quickly, not privately. This would have been a spectacle designed to be remembered for generations. Execution dock would have been too small. They would have built a special scaffold in a more prominent location. Maybe Tower Hill. Maybe Hyde Park. Somewhere that could accommodate the tens of thousands of spectators who would have come from across England to watch the most powerful pirate in history hang. The newspapers would have described every detail. What she wore, how she walked, whether she cried or remained stoic. Her last words would have been recorded and analyzed and reprinted in every language in Europe. And after death, her body would have been gibbeted. Not for months, for years. Displayed at the entrance to the Thames where every ship entering London would see it. The message would have been unmistakable. This is what happens to women who command empires. Because that's what truly terrified European powers about Qing Shi. Not that she was a criminal. Not that she attacked ships or controlled trade routes. It was that she proved something they desperately needed to deny. She proved that women could lead. That they could strategize on a grand scale. That they could command the loyalty of tens of thousands of men. That they could defeat professional militaries and negotiate with governments as equals. Every argument used to keep women out of power, that they were too weak, too emotional, too irrational to lead, was demolished by her existence. And if one woman could do this, what did that say about all the other women being told they were naturally inferior? That's why every other female pirate had to be destroyed so thoroughly. That's why their stories had to be erased. That's why the punishments had to be so extreme and so public. The system couldn't afford to let women succeed at this, because success would prove the system was a lie. Qing Shi succeeded because she never gave European powers the chance to stop her. She operated in a different legal framework, one where her gender was still a factor but not an absolute disqualification. Chinese authorities cared about power and pragmatism. She had power. It was pragmatic to negotiate rather than keep fighting a war they were losing. When she walked into those negotiations in 1810, she walked in as a commander. Not as a woman who needed to be punished for abandoning her role, but as a military leader who needed to be neutralized through diplomacy rather than force. The Chinese government gave her a title, Lady by Imperial Decree. They gave her a pension. They let her keep her wealth. They integrated her former fleet into their own navy. They treated her like a defeated enemy who could be converted into an ally. European powers would never have done that. Not for a woman. Not in 1,000 years. Qing Shi died in 1844, She was 69 years old. She'd spent her final decades running a successful gambling house, managing investments, and living in comfort. When she died, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Her wealth passed to her family. Her life was considered a success. She's buried in a marked grave. Her story was recorded. Her name was remembered. She's the exception that proves the rule. Because she's the only one. The only female pirate of that era who wasn't imprisoned, tortured, executed, or erased. The only one who got to grow old. The only one who got to be remembered as something other than a cautionary tale. And the reason she's the only one is because she never fell into European hands. Every other woman who dared to live as she lived, who dared to claim the same freedom and power, they all faced the same brutal end. Qing Shi's survival wasn't a sign that the system could be merciful to women who transgressed. It was a reminder of just how ruthlessly it destroyed them when it got the chance. Not every woman arrested for piracy was a pirate. Some never held a weapon, never boarded a ship, never participated in a single raid. They were simply nearby when the arrests happened. And that was enough. When naval forces raided pirate ships or pirate havens, they arrested everyone. The crew, obviously, but also the women found on board, the wives waiting on shore, the prostitutes who worked in the taverns where pirates spent their stolen gold, the servants in households that had sheltered wanted men. Proximity became guilt. The legal category was accessory to piracy. It was deliberately vague. It could mean anything from actively helping pirates to simply knowing about their activities and not reporting them. It could mean providing food, shelter, or companionship to men who were later identified as pirates. Could mean being married to the wrong man. The court records are full of these cases. Women arrested not because they committed crimes themselves, but because they existed in the orbit of men who did. Take the case of Dorothy Thomas. Plymouth, England, 1722. Her husband was a sailor named William Thomas. He went to sea for months at a time. Dorothy stayed home, raised their 2 children, worked as a seamstress to supplement the irregular income. In March 1722, William's ship was intercepted by the Royal Navy. It turned out the vessel had been engaging in piracy off the coast of West Africa. William Thomas was arrested along with the entire crew. 3 weeks later, naval officers came to Dorothy's home. She was arrested as an accessory. Her crime? She'd been spending money that her husband had sent home. Money that was now determined to have come from piracy. Dorothy's defense was straightforward. She had no idea where the money came from. Her husband told her he was working on a merchant vessel. She believed him. She was simply trying to feed her children. The prosecution's response? She should have questioned why her husband was sending more money than a typical sailor's wage. Her failure to investigate made her complicit. She was convicted. Her children were taken and placed in a parish workhouse. Her property, their home, was seized by the Crown. Dorothy Thomas spent 4 years in prison. She was never formally sentenced, never given a release date, just held indefinitely as a lesson. When she was finally released in 1726, her children had both died in the workhouse. Her home had been sold. She had nothing. She disappeared from the records after that. No death certificate, no burial record. Just another woman erased. And Dorothy's case wasn't unique. The archives contain dozens of similar stories. Then there were the women found on pirate ships during raids. The legal question was always the same. Was she there by choice or by force? If she was a captive, taken during a raid, held against her will, then technically she was a victim and should be freed. But if she was there willingly, if she'd chosen to sail with pirates, then she was complicit. The problem was proving which category you fell into. In 1718, a woman named Sarah Whitehead was found aboard a pirate vessel captured near the Bahamas. She testified that she'd been taken from a merchant ship 3 months earlier. She'd been working as a passenger, traveling to Jamaica to meet her fiancé. Pirates attacked the ship, killed most of the crew, and took her captive. The prosecution produced witnesses who testified they'd seen Sarah laughing with the pirates, eating meals with them, One claimed he'd seen her mending their clothes. Sarah's explanation: she did what she had to do to survive. She was a prisoner trying not to be killed. The prosecution's interpretation: she'd made herself useful. She'd integrated into the crew. That was collaboration, not captivity. The jury couldn't reach a verdict. Sarah was held in prison for 8 months while authorities decided what to do with her. Eventually, she was released. Not because she was found innocent, but because the witnesses and crew members had all been executed and there was no one left to testify. She was freed into a world where everyone knew she'd been arrested for piracy. No one would hire her. No family would shelter her. Her fiancé had married someone else. The last record of Sarah Whitehead is a 1719 entry in a Port Royal parish register. Charity given to Sarah W. Vagrant woman, 2 shillings. Then nothing. But the harshest treatment was reserved for prostitutes. Port Royal, Jamaica, Tortuga, Nassau. Every pirate haven had brothels, taverns, and boarding houses where pirates spent their money between raids. The women who worked there, serving drinks, providing companionship, renting rooms, were considered part of the criminal infrastructure. When authorities cracked down on pirate havens, these women were arrested en masse. In 1720, when the British Navy occupied Nassau and began arresting pirates, they also rounded up over 40 women who worked in the port's taverns and brothels. The charge was providing material support to enemies of the crown. Most of these women were never given trials. They were simply imprisoned. Some for months, some for years, some died in custody. One woman, identified in records only as Jane, a mulatto prostitute, was held in a Nassau prison for 3 years without trial. When a new governor took office in 1723 and reviewed the prison rolls, he found her still there. He wrote to London asking what should be done with her. The response took 6 months. By the time it arrived, Jane had died of dysentery. The cruelest cases involved women forced to testify against their partners. When a pirate was arrested, authorities would often arrest his wife or lover as well. Then they'd offer a deal. Testify against him, provide details of his activities, and you'll be freed. Refuse and you'll hang beside him. The trial records preserve these moments. Women on the witness stand, crying, describing their husbands' crimes in detail while those husbands sat shackled in the courtroom listening. In 1715, a woman named Elizabeth Burwell testified against her husband Thomas in a Port Royal courtroom. She described raids he'd told her about, victims he'd mentioned, stolen goods he'd brought home. Her testimony was the primary evidence used to convict him. Thomas Burwell was hanged on November 3, 1715. Elizabeth was released as promised. But she was released into a community that had watched her send her husband to the gallows. No one would speak to her. No one would employ her. She was seen as a traitor and a collaborator simultaneously, hated by both sides. She hanged herself 6 weeks later. And then there were the children. When women were imprisoned for piracy-related charges, their children often came with them. Not because the law required it, but because there was nowhere else for them to go. Families wouldn't take them. Parish authorities didn't want them. So they ended up in prison cells with their mothers. Spanish Town prison records from 1720 note, 3 infant children residing in the women's wing, born to female prisoners convicted of piracy or accessory charges. These children grew up in prison. Some died there. Those who survived carried the stigma their entire lives. A 1728 London parish record notes the baptism of John, son of Martha C. Pirate's woman, father unknown. The designation pirate's woman would follow that child forever. It would determine who would hire him, who would rent to him, who would allow their children to associate with him. The punishment didn't end with the arrest. It metastasized. It spread to families, to children, to entire communities. Property was seized automatically. If a man was convicted of piracy, everything he owned, his home, his land, his possessions became property of the crown. His wife had no legal claim to any of it, even if she brought property into the marriage or purchased items with her own earnings. Women whose husbands were executed for piracy often found themselves homeless within days. literally thrown into the street with their children and whatever they could carry. The economic devastation was permanent. These women couldn't work respectable jobs. No one would hire the wife of a pirate. They couldn't remarry. No man wanted the legal and social liability. They couldn't claim charity. Parish authorities considered them morally corrupt. They ended up as beggars, prostitutes, or corpses. The system didn't just punish the women who became pirates. It punished any woman who'd been touched by piracy in any way. Wives, companions, witnesses, victims. It destroyed them all with the same ruthless efficiency. Because the message wasn't just, don't become a pirate. The message was, don't associate with the wrong people. Don't ask questions your husband doesn't want to answer. Don't work in the wrong tavern. Don't survive a pirate attack the wrong way. Stay in your place. Know your role. Never step outside the lines. And if you do, even accidentally, even through no fault of your own, you'll be destroyed just as thoroughly as the women who chose this life deliberately. There's one more exception to the pattern of execution and erasure. Her name was Grain Neemhale. The English called her Grace O'Malley. And in September 1593, she walked into Greenwich Palace and sat down across from Queen Elizabeth I. Two queens, face to face. One ruling England, the other ruling the waves off the Irish coast. Grace O'Malley was 63 years old at the time of that meeting. She'd spent 4 decades as what the English called a pirate and what the Irish called a chieftain. She commanded a fleet of galleys that controlled the entire western coast of Ireland. She attacked English supply ships. She raided coastal settlements. She collected taxes from fishing villages and charged passage fees to any vessel that wanted to sail through her waters. The English crown had tried to stop her multiple times. They'd failed. So she did something no other pirate, male or female, had done. She requested a meeting with the Queen, and Elizabeth agreed. The question is, why did Grace O'Malley survive when every other woman pirate we've discussed was destroyed? The answer isn't mercy. It's power. Grace O'Malley wasn't just a pirate. She was Irish nobility. The O'Malley clan controlled significant territory in Western Ireland. Her father had been a chieftain. Her first husband was the heir to another powerful Irish family. When he died, she inherited his fleet. When she married her second husband, she negotiated a contract that allowed her to keep independent control of her ships and property. She had legitimacy, not English legitimacy, but Irish legitimacy. And in 1593 that mattered, because England was struggling to control Ireland. Rebellions were constant. The Spanish were providing support to Irish resistance forces. England needed allies in Ireland, not more enemies. Grace O'Malley understood this. She understood that timing and leverage could accomplish what force couldn't. In 1593, English authorities had arrested 2 of her sons and her half-brother. They were being held on charges of rebellion. Her lands were under threat of seizure. English governors in Ireland were demanding her arrest. So Grace wrote directly to Queen Elizabeth. In Latin, the diplomatic language of the era. A letter from one sovereign to another. She didn't beg. She negotiated. She pointed out that her family had been loyal to the crown during recent rebellions. A lie, but one that was hard to disprove. She offered to use her fleet to suppress piracy in Western Irish waters, the very piracy she'd been profiting from for decades. She requested a meeting to discuss terms. Elizabeth's advisors urged her to refuse. They wanted Grace arrested and executed. She was a pirate, a rebel, a woman who'd spent 40 years defying English authority. But Elizabeth was practical. She needed stability in Ireland more than she needed another public execution. And she was curious. By all accounts, Elizabeth wanted to meet this woman who'd built her own naval empire. The meeting took place in September 1593 at Greenwich Palace. No written transcript survives, but multiple courtiers documented what happened in letters and journals. Grace O'Malley arrived dressed in Irish clothing, not English fashion. She refused to bow when she entered the room. The 2 women spoke in Latin. Grace spoke no English, Elizabeth spoke no Irish, but both were fluent in Latin. According to Sir Robert Cecil, who was present, The conversation was direct and businesslike. Grace laid out her terms. Release her sons and brother, restore her family's lands, grant her formal permission to continue maritime activities along the Irish coast. Elizabeth countered. Grace would cease all attacks on English vessels, would provide naval support against Spanish ships in Irish waters, and would swear loyalty to the crown. They negotiated for over an hour. The result was a formal agreement. Grace's sons and brother would be released. Her lands would be restored. She would receive a pension from the English crown. In exchange, she would patrol Western Irish waters and report any Spanish activity. She would not attack English ships. She didn't swear loyalty. That was never mentioned again. The deal was ratified within days. Grace O'Malley walked out of Greenwich Palace with everything she'd asked for. Why did this work when no other woman pirate's negotiation ever succeeded? Because Grace O'Malley had what no other woman pirate possessed: political capital. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a chieftain with territorial control. She had a fleet that could be useful to England or devastating to English interests. She had timing. England needed her more than she needed England at that particular moment. And crucially, she negotiated as a sovereign, not a subject. When Bonny stood in a Jamaican courtroom, she was a criminal begging for mercy. When Grace O'Malley sat across from Elizabeth I, she was a power broker offering an alliance. The English legal system couldn't execute a woman who'd never formally submitted to English law. Grace O'Malley operated in a gray area between English and Irish jurisdiction. She was too powerful to arrest safely, too useful to kill, and too politically connected to simply erase. So instead, England negotiated. Grace O'Malley kept her fleet. She continued her maritime activities, though she was careful to avoid English vessels after 1593. She lived in her castle at Rockfleet overlooking Clew Bay. She commanded respect from both Irish and English authorities. When she died in 1603, the same year as Queen Elizabeth I, she died in her own bed, in her own castle, surrounded by family. She was approximately 73 years old. She'd outlived almost every pirate of her era by decades. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Her lands passed to her descendants. Her name was remembered in Irish history not as a criminal or a cautionary tale, but as a legendary figure. A woman who'd defied empires and survived. But here's what's critical to understand. Grace O'Malley's survival wasn't evidence that the system could be fair to women. It was evidence that the system could be bypassed if you had enough power. Every other woman pirate lacked what Grace had. They weren't nobility. They didn't control territory. They couldn't offer political alliances. They had no leverage except their lives, and the system took those without hesitation. Grace O'Malley survived because she was powerful enough that executing her would have caused more problems than letting her live. That's not mercy. That's pragmatism. And it only worked once. For one woman. In one very specific set of circumstances that would never be repeated. Grace O'Malley meeting with Queen Elizabeth I is often portrayed as this triumphant moment of female solidarity. Two powerful women recognizing each other as equals. That's a comforting story. But it's not accurate. Elizabeth didn't see Grace as an equal. She saw her as a problem that needed a solution. Execution was one solution. Negotiation was another. She chose negotiation because it was strategically smarter. Grace didn't see Elizabeth as a fellow woman to be admired. She saw her as the head of an empire that threatened her homeland. She negotiated because she needed to protect her family and her territory. There was no sisterhood. Just two rulers doing what rulers do, calculating, negotiating, securing their interests. Grace O'Malley's survival is extraordinary. But it's not a model that any other woman could have followed. She succeeded because she had advantages, birth, wealth, timing, political leverage, that no other female pirate possessed. For every woman like Grace O'Malley who negotiated her way to survival, there were hundreds like Bonny, Mary Read, and Rachel Wall who had no leverage and no options. They were hanged, burned, gibbeted, and erased. Grace O'Malley is the exception that proves just how absolute and merciless the rule was. We know in Bonny's name, Mary Read's name, Rachel Wall's name, Grace O'Malley's name. But most of the women who were executed for piracy don't have names. Not anymore. Port Royal, Jamaica. Court records from 1718. An entry dated July 14th reads, "Unknown woman, African, hanged for piracy." No further information. That's it. No name, no age, no details of her alleged crime, no trial transcript. Just confirmation that a woman was killed. She existed. She died. And that's all we'll ever know about her. The archives are full of entries like this. 2 women, names unrecorded, executed for piracy. Nassau, 1720. Female prisoner, unnamed, died in custody awaiting trial. Bridgetown, 1715. Unknown woman of mixed race, gibbeted at harbor entrance. Tortuga, 1702. These aren't isolated cases. In the Port Royal archives alone, there are at least 47 entries recording the execution or imprisonment of women for piracy-related charges where no name is given. Just unknown woman or female prisoner, or sometimes just a number. The British Admiralty records are worse. Prison ship logs from the 1700s list female prisoners numerically. Female prisoner 7. Female prisoner 12. Not even unknown woman. Just a number assigned when they were arrested. Some of these entries include brief notes. Prisoner 7, died of fever, February 1719. But most don't. Just numbers that stop appearing in the logs. No indication of whether they were executed, died in custody, or were somehow released. They were people. They had names, families, lives, stories, and all of it was erased. Archaeological evidence tells us the scale of this erasure. In 2003, construction workers in Kingston, Jamaica uncovered a mass grave near the site of the old Port Royal execution grounds. Forensic analysis dated the burials to between 1680 and 1730, the peak of piracy prosecutions in the Caribbean. The grave contained the remains of at least 63 individuals. 14 of them were female. Several showed evidence of hanging trauma, fractured cervical vertebrae, rope marks preserved on bone. 3 showed evidence of gibbeting, bones scattered and weathered from prolonged exposure. No burial markers, no records, no way to identify who they were. 14 women executed and thrown into an unmarked pit. Not important enough for individual graves. Not worth the effort of recording their names. Some of these women were likely pirates, but many probably weren't. Because the court records that do survive tell us about a category of victim that barely registered in the legal system. Servant girls forced onto pirate ships. When pirates raided coastal settlements or boarded merchant vessels, they sometimes took servants, enslaved women, and young girls. Not as captives to ransom, but as labor. Someone to cook, clean, mend sails. Someone who had no choice but to comply. When these ships were captured, everyone on board was arrested as a pirate. The defense was obvious. I was forced. I was taken against my will. But how do you prove that? How do you prove you weren't a willing participant when you've been living on a pirate ship for months or years? The trial records show that this defense rarely worked. Prosecutors argued that any woman who'd survived on a pirate ship must have made herself useful. Must have cooperated, must have been complicit. In 1716, a 14-year-old girl was arrested when the pirate ship she was on was captured off Jamaica. Her name appears in the initial arrest records as Sarah, servant girl, age 14. She testified that she'd been taken from her employer's household in Port Royal 6 months earlier during a raid. She'd been kept on the ship to cook and clean. She tried to escape once and been beaten. The prosecutor asked why she hadn't jumped overboard and swum to shore when the ship was near land. Asked why she hadn't refused to work. Asked why she'd been seen laughing with crew members. She had no good answers. She'd been 14 years old, surrounded by armed men, hundreds of miles from home. She'd done what she had to do to survive. The jury convicted her of piracy. The judge sentenced her to death. Sarah was hanged on March 12, 1718. The records note that she was the youngest person executed for piracy in Port Royal that year. After that single mention, her name disappears. No record of where she was buried. No indication that anyone claimed her body or mourned her death. She was 14 years old. Then there are the women of color, enslaved women, free black women, indigenous women, women of mixed race. They faced double erasure. Their gender made them targets. Their race made them invisible. Caribbean court records from the piracy trials show a pattern. White women, even those convicted and executed, usually have their names recorded. Women of color are almost always listed as Negro woman or mulatto woman, or simply slave female. In 1721, an enslaved woman in Barbados was accused of providing food and information to a pirate crew. Her owner testified against her. She was convicted and executed within a week. The court record lists her as Negro woman, property of William Ashford. No name, no age, no defense presented on her behalf because enslaved people had no legal standing. She was property accused of helping pirates. She was destroyed like any other evidence of the crime. How many women like her were executed? We'll never know. Enslaved people weren't always recorded in court documents. Their deaths didn't require the same paperwork as the execution of free people. Archaeological sites throughout the Caribbean contain unmarked graves from this era. Forensic analysis can tell us gender, approximate age, sometimes cause of death. But not identity, not names, not stories. The records that might tell us more were deliberately destroyed. In 1760, the governor of Jamaica ordered that all prison records older than 20 years be disposed of to make room for current documentation. Decades of execution records, trial transcripts, and prisoner logs were burned. The same thing happened in other colonial ports. Nassau, Bridgetown, Charleston, Savannah, Port Royal. Administrators would periodically clear out old records, and with them went thousands of names. Some historians believe this wasn't just bureaucratic housekeeping. It was intentional erasure. These were embarrassing records, evidence of how many people, especially how many women, colonial authorities had executed. Evidence of brutal punishments, questionable trials, and systematic destruction of human lives. Better to burn the evidence and pretend it never happened. So we're left with fragments. Scattered entries in surviving documents. Archaeological remains. Occasional mentions in private letters or journals. And the overwhelming certainty that for every woman pirate whose name we know, there were dozens whose names are lost forever. And Bonny is famous because her story was so unusual it got recorded in detail. But for every in Bonny, there was a female prisoner 7, who died in a prison ship and was thrown overboard. A Negro woman, unnamed, who was hanged and buried in a mass grave. A 14-year-old servant girl whose name appeared once in court records and never again. These women lived. They suffered. They died. And then they were erased so thoroughly that we can't even count how many of them there were. The best estimates, based on fragmentary records, archaeological evidence, and extrapolation from documented cases, suggest that between 2,000 and 5,000 women were executed for piracy or piracy-related charges between 1650 and 1830. But that's just an estimate. The real number could be higher, could be much higher. We'll never know, because the system that killed them also erased them, made sure their stories couldn't inspire other women, made sure their names couldn't be remembered, made sure that future generations would think female pirates were rare exceptions rather than a regular, ruthlessly suppressed phenomenon. History erased these women twice, once at the gallows, again in the history books. Throne of Lies exists to drag these stories back into the light. If you believe these women deserved better than unmarked graves and forgotten names, subscribe. Be part of making sure they're never forgotten again. Here's the question we haven't answered yet. Why? Why was the punishment so extreme? Why the torture, the public humiliation, the extended displays of bodies in cages? Why did authorities spend more resources destroying female pirates than they did fighting wars? Male pirates were hanged efficiently and forgotten. Female pirates were destroyed systematically and remembered as warnings. What made them so dangerous? The answer isn't about piracy. It's about power. Female pirates threatened three interconnected power structures simultaneously. And when all three structures felt threatened at once, the response was total annihilation. First, maritime law. The entire legal framework governing the seas was built by men, for men. Ship captains were men. Naval officers were men. Magistrates who tried piracy cases were men. The language of maritime law assumed masculinity. He shall be hanged. His property shall be seized. Women weren't supposed to exist in this system except as passengers or cargo. When women became pirates, when they commanded ships, navigated by stars, fought in battles, made tactical decisions, they proved the system's foundation was arbitrary. If women could do everything men did at sea, what justified excluding them? That question was too dangerous to allow. Second, social order. The entire structure of European society in the 1600s and 1700s depended on strict gender roles. Women belonged in homes. They raised children. They obeyed fathers, then husbands, then sons. Their labor was domestic. Their lives were circumscribed. This wasn't just tradition. It was law. Women couldn't own property in most jurisdictions, couldn't vote, couldn't testify in court on equal footing with men, couldn't choose their own marriages or leave abusive ones. The justification for all of this was that women were naturally suited to domestic life and naturally unsuited to everything else. Too weak for physical labor, too emotional for leadership, too irrational for complex decision-making. Female pirates demolished this justification. They proved women could be strong, could lead, could make life or death decisions under pressure. They proved women could survive, thrive, in the most hostile environments imaginable. If the fundamental justification for women's legal inferiority was false, then the entire social structure was built on a lie. That realization couldn't be permitted to spread. Third, imperial control. Piracy wasn't just crime. It was economic warfare. Pirates disrupted colonial trade routes. They stole goods meant for European markets. They challenged the monopolies that enriched empires. But more than that, they represented an alternative to imperial order. Pirate communities were often multiracial, multinational, and surprisingly democratic. They elected their captains. They divided plunder according to agreed-upon rules. They created their own societies outside the control of kings and governors. Female pirates took this one step further. They proved that women could exist outside patriarchal control entirely. They didn't need fathers or husbands to survive. They could create their own communities, their own economies, their own lives. That was revolutionary. And revolutions had to be crushed. So when a female pirate was captured, she wasn't just a criminal. She was an existential threat to three interlocking systems of power. And the punishment had to send a message to all three systems. This will not be tolerated. That's why the executions were public theater. When male pirates were hanged, the crowds were large but orderly. People came to see justice done. They watched, they left, they went about their lives. When female pirates were hanged, the crowds were enormous and frenzied. Contemporary accounts describe the execution of a woman known only as Black Joan in 1704. An estimated 8,000 people crammed into the execution ground at Wapping. That was more than attended most royal events. People traveled from other cities. They brought their families. They fought for viewing positions. Why? Because this wasn't just an execution. It was a spectacle of gender correction. They were watching a woman who'd stepped outside her role be violently forced back into it, or rather, be violently removed from existence for refusing to stay in it. The entertainment value was explicit. Newspapers advertised upcoming executions of female pirates like theatrical performances. The Woman Pirate and Bonny to be tried November 16th. Spectators welcomed. The legal writings of the era make the reasoning clear. In 1725, English judge Sir William Hawkins wrote in his treatise on criminal law, "Women who engage in piracy or other masculine crimes have abandoned the protection that their sex affords them. They must be punished not only for their crimes but for their rejection of natural feminine virtue." Their punishment should serve as example to all women of the consequences of such abandonment. Read that carefully. Punished not only for their crimes but for their rejection of natural feminine virtue. The crime wasn't just piracy. The crime was being a woman who refused to perform femininity correctly. A 1718 court document from Jamaica is even more explicit. The magistrate, sentencing a woman named Catherine Walsh to death for piracy, stated, "This woman's crimes are aggravated by her sex. She has shown herself to be unwomanly, unnatural, and unfit for the mercies ordinarily extended to her weaker kind. Let her punishment be severe and public, that other women may learn the wages of such behavior." This wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtext. Authorities explicitly stated that women were being punished more harshly specifically because they were women who'd acted like men. There was an economic component as well. Sailors and naval officers viewed women at sea as direct competition for limited jobs. If women could be sailors, why would ship owners hire men who demanded higher wages? If women could be naval officers, why maintain the expensive system of male-only maritime education? Trade guilds lobbied governments to ban women from maritime work. They argued that women's presence threatened men's livelihoods, that it would drive down wages, that it would undermine professional standards. Female pirates, women who'd succeeded at sea without anyone's permission, were evidence that these concerns had merit. So sailors and officers often testified enthusiastically against captured female pirates. They wanted these women destroyed as warnings. They wanted it understood that the sea was male territory and women who invaded it would be eliminated. Religious authorities provided the moral framework. Sermons preached after the execution of female pirates consistently invoked the biblical figure of Jezebel. A woman who'd wielded power, refused male authority, and been violently destroyed as divine punishment. A 1720 sermon delivered in Port Royal after Bonny's trial declared, "As Jezebel was thrown down and devoured by dogs for her pride and rebellion, so too must these modern Jezebels be cast down. A woman who takes up arms is a woman who has invited Satan into her heart." The message was clear. Female pirates weren't just criminals. They were spiritually corrupted. Their very existence was an offense against God's design. This religious framing gave moral legitimacy to the brutality. It wasn't cruelty, it was righteous punishment. It wasn't excessive, it was necessary to cleanse society of sin. The impact of all this, the executions, the torture, the erasure, the propaganda, lasted for centuries. After 1730, as the golden age of piracy ended and naval powers reasserted control over shipping lanes, women virtually disappeared from maritime life. Not because they couldn't do the work. We know they could, the female pirates had proven that definitively. But because the message had been received. Mothers told daughters about Bonny and Mary Read, not as heroes but as cautionary tales. About what happens to women who refuse their place. Young women who might have gone to sea stayed home instead, terrified of ending up in a gibbet cage. The legal prohibitions expanded. By 1800, most European nations had explicit laws forbidding women from working on ships except as passengers. These laws stayed in effect until the early 1900s. It took 200 years for women to return to maritime professions in significant numbers. 200 years for the terror instilled by those executions to fade enough that women dared to go to sea again. The brutality worked. It destroyed the women who dared to step outside their assigned roles. Terrified other women into compliance. It reinforced the power structures that depended on keeping women confined. That was always the point. The executions weren't about justice. They were about control. About making sure that every woman who watched or heard about these deaths understood. Your freedom ends where male authority begins. Step outside that boundary and you won't just be punished. You'll be destroyed so thoroughly that your name will be forgotten and your story will become a warning rather than an inspiration. The system succeeded. For centuries it succeeded. Which makes it all the more important that we remember now. Let's count the cost. Between 1650 and 1830, a span of 180 years, at least 130 women were formally tried and executed for piracy in courts with surviving records. But we know that's not the real number. Add the women listed only as unknown or given numbers instead of names in prison logs. Add the women executed without trial in Caribbean ports where record-keeping was inconsistent or non-existent. Add the enslaved women killed for allegedly helping pirates. Add the women who died in prison awaiting trials that never came. Add the wives and companions destroyed as collateral damage. The real count? Historians estimate between 2,000 and 5,000 women were killed. 2,000 to 5,000 women executed, imprisoned to death, or erased for the crime of refusing to stay in their assigned place. That's more than the total number of people executed during the Salem witch trials. More than the casualties in many actual wars of the era. And it was systematic, calculated, sustained across nearly 2 centuries and multiple empires. The British did it. The Spanish did it. The French did it. The Dutch did it. Different nations, different languages, different legal systems, but the same brutal consensus. Women who went to sea had to be destroyed. The impact lasted far beyond the executions themselves. By 1830, women had essentially vanished from maritime professions. Not because they'd lost interest or proven incapable, but because the message had been burned into cultural consciousness. This path leads to death. Laws formalized what terror had already accomplished. Britain passed legislation in 1851 explicitly forbidding women from working aboard merchant or naval vessels except as passengers. France followed in 1857. The United States enacted similar restrictions in 1873. These weren't laws against piracy. These were laws against women's presence at sea at all. The justification was always the same. Women were too delicate for maritime life. Too weak for the physical demands. Their presence would distract male crews and undermine discipline. Never mind that women had worked on ships for centuries. Never mind that female pirates had proven themselves as capable as any male sailor. The historical record was rewritten. Female pirates were erased from popular histories. The few who were remembered, and Bonny and Mary Read, were portrayed as bizarre anomalies rather than part of a larger phenomenon. When women finally began returning to maritime professions in the early 20th century, they had to fight every step of the way. They faced harassment, discrimination, and constant assertions that they didn't belong. The first woman officially admitted to a naval academy didn't happen until 1976. That's less than 50 years ago. It took 200 years for women to regain access to the space that female pirates had fought and died for. The erasure was so complete that most people today have no idea how many women were pirates, how common it actually was, how violently the system responded. That erasure was intentional, because if people knew, if women throughout history had known, that thousands of other women had chosen freedom over safety, had commanded ships and fought battles and built their own communities outside male control, it would have changed everything. It would have proven that women's confinement to domestic life wasn't natural or inevitable. It was enforced, violently enforced. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That enforcement never really stopped. The methods changed. We don't gibbet women in iron cages anymore. We don't burn them at stakes. But society still punishes women who step outside prescribed boundaries. Still questions their motives. Still subjects them to scrutiny that men in the same positions never face. Women who seek power are called ambitious, and that's not a compliment. Women who compete in male-dominated fields face constant questions about whether they belong there. Women who prioritize career over family are labeled selfish. Women who demand equality are told they're aggressive. The vocabulary has changed. The fundamental mechanism hasn't. The question women face today is the same question female pirates faced. How much are you willing to risk for freedom? Because every woman who became a pirate knew the risks. They'd seen the gibbets. They'd heard the stories. They knew exactly what would happen if they were caught. And they did it anyway. And Bonny knew what awaited her if she was captured. She'd grown up in port towns where executed pirates hung in cages at harbor entrances. She understood the consequences. She went to sea anyway. Mary Read had survived war, poverty, and years of hiding her gender. She could have stayed safe. Could have lived quietly as a woman in some European town. She chose the pirate's life instead. Rachel Wall knew highway robbery could get her hanged. She'd lived 7 years as a poor but law-abiding widow. She could have stayed that way. She chose risk over compliance. These women weren't naive. They weren't ignorant of the consequences. They made calculated decisions that freedom, even temporary, precarious, dangerous freedom, was worth more than safe subjugation. That's what the authorities understood. That's what terrified them. These women weren't victims of circumstance. They were people who'd looked at the options available to them within society's rules and decided those options weren't acceptable. So they broke the rules, knowing the cost, willing to pay it, and thousands of them did pay it, with their lives, with their names, with their place in history, but they lived first, on their own terms, making their own choices, free. Think about Bonny standing in that Jamaican prison, watching Calico Jack being led to the gallows. He's crying, begging for more time, claiming he was forced into piracy, that he never wanted this life. And Bonny, pregnant with his child, knowing she'll likely follow him to that same gallows in a few months, looks at him and says, "I'm sorry to see you here, but if you'd fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." That's not the voice of a victim. That's not someone who regrets her choices. That's a woman who chose this life, knew the stakes, and faced the consequences without flinching. Her last recorded words weren't an apology or a plea. They were a condemnation of cowardice and a defense of the life she'd chosen. Even facing death, even pregnant and chained, she refused to perform the role they wanted from her. Refused to be the repentant woman begging for mercy. She went out on her own terms. Whatever happened after, execution, imprisonment, mysterious disappearance, she never broke. That's what they couldn't destroy. That's what survives despite the gibbets and the burnings and the systematic erasure. The choice, the defiance, the refusal to accept that safety was worth more than freedom. The authorities executed the women, but they couldn't kill what those women represented. Because the question remains, for every generation, for every person facing the boundaries society draws around them, what would you risk for freedom? How much safety would you trade for the chance to live on your own terms? What would you be willing to lose to gain control over your own life? Female pirates answered those questions with their lives. They chose freedom. They paid the price. And we're still talking about them. Not because they were cautionary tales, though that's what the authorities intended, but because they were proof. Proof that the boundaries can be crossed, that the roles can be refused, that women can be just as brave, just as capable, just as willing to risk everything as anyone else. They died. They were erased. They were forgotten. But we're bringing them back. Every name we recover, every story we tell, every time we refuse to let them be forgotten, we're undoing the erasure. We're making sure that what they chose, what they fought for, what they died for actually meant something. And Bonny and Mary Read didn't die so we could pity them. They died so we could remember that the choice exists. Freedom or safety. They chose freedom. What would you choose?